What do we actually mean when we say assessment is fair? Because one of the assumptions underlying many assessment processes is that if something is consistent, it's also fair. But those two things are not always the same thing. Most assessment systems are designed around an ideal candidate. Well, what does an ideal candidate mean? Someone who is calm, confident, literate, digitally fluent, familiar with assessment processes already, and operating in controlled conditions. So today we explore a deeper question because candidates do not always arrive in those conditions. Are we measuring capability, or are we measuring how somebody copes with the way capability is assessed? Because once we start asking that question properly, accessibility stops being a compliance conversation and we start talking about validity. And that changes things dramatically. So I'd like to introduce our two presenters today. First, we have Robert Burns, Head of Consulting at Cirrus Assessment. Robert brings more than 25 years of experience in professional education and high-stakes assessment, and he's helped organizations worldwide deliver fair, reliable, and secure exams. And joining us from ReadSpeaker is Hugh McNeela. Hugh works with schools, companies, and institutions in the UK and Ireland to make learning and assessment more fair, inclusive, and accessible for all learners. And as a quick side note, myself and Hugh are both diagnosed with ADHD. So this is something that is near and dear to our hearts. We know how challenging the current system can be, the way of assessment and the current learning processes can be frustrating for somebody who's neurodiverse. So it's really coming from a place of understanding. I'll introduce our next session briefly. If candidates don't arrive under the same conditions, then we need to think carefully about what our assessments are actually measuring. Because while we often focus on the capability we're trying to assess, there can be a lot of other factors influencing performance too. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand it over to Robbie to explore what we're really measuring when we design an assessment.
Thanks, Cristina. That was quite an introduction. Thank you very much. So I think when we design assessments, we usually start from the right place. And we ask ourselves, what knowledge, skill, judgment are we trying to measure? But the problem is that the assessments very rarely only measure one thing. Every design decision that we make introduces something additional into the process. It adds something onto it. So, for example, when we design our instructions, they can reward assessment literacy. Time pressure can reward stress tolerance or even processing speed. If we're using digital tools, then they can reward the candidate's digital confidence. The complexity of the language that we use within the assessment can reward the candidate's fluency in reading. And even how we design the navigation and the sequencing of the assessment can give an advantage to candidates who understand assessment environments better or who are actually just more confident in those environments. And none of that is intentional, normally. No, we don't set out to create barriers, but they can still emerge through those design decisions that we make. As an example, let's take a numerical reasoning assessment. If the language that we use to create that assessment is unnecessarily complex, then we're no longer just measuring numerical reasoning, we're also measuring reading comprehension. Or if we use a digital tool within the assessment, one that the candidates haven't used before, perhaps one that is different to the tools that they use day to day, then we're measuring their adaptability to unfamiliar technology. And that's where the distinction between competence and coping mechanisms becomes really important, because by designing without taking those factors into consideration, we can end up causing candidates to fail, not because they lack the capability, but because the assessment itself is asking them to navigate barriers that actually bear no relevance to the capability that we're trying to assess. And that brings us to another distinction that matters hugely in assessment design. Reliability and validity are really often confused, but they're not the same thing. Reliability asks us, was the assessment delivered consistently? Whereas validity is asking us, did we actually measure what we set out to measure? Well, we can create an assessment that's highly reliable, but it can still be measuring the wrong things. And a good example might be a driving theory assessment. So let's imagine, and this is a hypothetical scenario, that the Driving Standards Agency wants to assess whether drivers who have moved to the country are suitably safe and knowledgeable to navigate the network of potholes that makes up the UK's road network. The assessment wants to evaluate whether the candidate can understand road signs, road rules, hazard perception. Can they confidently dodge one pothole without falling into another one? That kind of thing. So they create an assessment to determine whether someone understands the rules of the road and can drive safely. And the assessment perfectly standardized, the same questions, the same timing, the same technology, the same kit, the same delivery conditions. So operationally, if you step back and look at it, it looks to be extremely fair. But there's a problem. The assessment has been lifted from the existing question bank that's used for the UK assessments. So it's written in English. In parts, the language is unnecessarily complex. Perhaps cultural phrasing is unfamiliar, and the candidate has never used the platform previously. So at that point, if we again take a step back, we have to ask ourselves, what are we really measuring? Well, are we measuring driving knowledge, or are we measuring the candidate's fluency in the English language? Are we measuring their digital confidence and their ability to adapt to new technology? And in that scenario, it is highly possible that some candidates will fail that assessment, not because they lack the driving knowledge, but because the assessment actually became one which tested their English language skills, their digital skills, and no longer just their driving competence. So the process, highly consistent, but consistency alone doesn't guarantee valid measurement. And that's the distinction that when we design assessments, we have to keep coming back to.
Yeah, thank you, Robbie. It's thinking about assumptions and asking the uncomfortable questions about what assessment might actually be measuring. Whenever we have conversations like this, there's always a risk that fairness starts to feel like a really big abstract concept. So what we'd like to do now is give you a simple framework that can help make sense of it. Take it away, Robbie.
Okay, thanks again, Cristina. So looking at what's on screen, the first layer is access. So at the most basic level, we're looking to establish, can all candidates participate properly? So that includes things like assistive technology, device compatibility, accessibility adjustments, screen readers, extra time, physical access. Because if someone can't properly access the assessment in the first place, then actually fairness is broken down before we even started.
Yeah, exactly. Because access on its own isn't enough. A candidate may be technically able to get into the assessment and still be disadvantaged by the design itself, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And that actually that leads us perfectly onto the second layer, which is validity. Are we actually measuring the intended capability, or are irrelevant barriers beginning to distort that performance? Are we assessing competence, or are we assessing the candidate's confidence, their familiarity with an assessment environment, their reading ability, their stress tolerance, all those things we spoke about previously? And this is where accessibility becomes a measurement question and not just a compliance question.
And what about the candidate experience? What does that actually look like from the candidate's perspective?
Yeah, that third layer, from the candidate's point of view, the experience layer is the most visible, because that actually shapes how the process is experienced by the candidate. Is the assessment clear and transparent? Does it feel reliable and trustworthy? Does it feel fair? Because the candidate's experience is actually what shapes their confidence, their engagement with us, and their trust in the assessment itself. So the three layers work together. As another example, if a candidate is sitting a digital assessment, access asks us, can all the candidates participate properly in the first place? And then once they're in, validity asks us, are we measuring the right thing? And then finally, the experience layer asks us, what does the process actually communicate to the candidate?
Yeah, it makes sense to separate these layers. A process can be accessible in the narrow sense that a candidate can take part, but still be invalid in what it measures or poor in the experience that it creates.
Absolutely. And the key message here is that fairness isn't just about giving everyone the same thing. It's about giving candidates a fair opportunity to demonstrate what they actually know and what they can do. As I say, an assessment can be technically accessible while still being invalid in what it measures or poor in the experience that it creates. There's a phrase that's used a lot in this sector where we speak about leveling the playing field for all candidates. And I don't think that's just the wrong metaphor. I think it's the wrong approach because it implies that there's one playing field and that fairness comes from every candidate playing in that field in exactly the same way. And I actually think that in assessment, fairness is less about that identical experience and much more about ensuring that every candidate has an equally valid route to go onto the playing field to demonstrate the capability that we're trying to measure. So equality of experience isn't necessarily equality of opportunity. And I think the days of asking, did everyone get the same experience, are actually gone. And we're probably now better asking, did everyone get a legitimate route to demonstrate their capability?
It's a lot to think about and digest. So I'm going to open it up now to more of a panel discussion. The frameworks are useful because they help us think about the challenges, but assessments don't happen in theory. They happen in real life, right? So every day the assessment teams are balancing fairness, validity, regulation, technology, costs, and candidate experience. It's a lot of juggling going on. So we'd like to move on from the theory into the practical and explore some of these challenges that come up with things that don't always pull in the same direction. So I am joined by Hugh and Robbie. So yeah, we've talked about the theory, we've looked at the framework, and we've touched on some of the practical realities. So let's look at what happens in the real world. As I said in my introduction, Robbie and Hugh come at this from a different perspective. Robbie has spent years in assessment design and delivery, so he's coming from that background, and Hugh from accessibility and assistive technology and making assessments as fair as they can be. So we've got a couple of questions that sit at the heart of this discussion, and I'd love to hear how each of you approaches this. So the first thing is why fairness becomes an afterthought. And I think it's fair to say that it's always kind of like an add-on sort of, yeah, we didn't think about that. Oh yeah, we have to do this because it's a compliance thing. So yeah, why does fairness become an afterthought?
Should I jump in first here, Robbie?
Go for it.
Please do. I've spoken enough already. Go for it.
Yeah, and thanks. I think you touched on a lot of the major points that surround this. I think if I was to kind of narrow this down to, let's say, a UK perspective, I think one of the things I've noticed as somebody working in accessibility when talking to people in assessment and assessment design is that traditionally the approach to building assessments has been quite sequential. So it's starting off with writing a question blueprint, moving on to reviewing the scientific accuracy of that, and then sending out as something that you then deploy by operations. And what that kind of ends up doing is creating more of like an operational logistics problem when it comes to accessibility and not really treating it as what I consider it to be, which is a pedagogical one. I'd say that's my first point. I think the second point is that when it comes to regulations as well, we've found that historically they've been written more in a design framework to prevent cheating, which I think has kind of inadvertently created more of an institutional culture where introducing alternative formats can kind of be treated with a bit of suspicion, I would say. And finally, I think it goes back to that point that you touched on, Robbie, which is about this myth of an average candidate experience, right? It's kind of just falling outside that standard curve, which is non-existent in my opinion, I would say. If I was to put this on a perspective of neurodiversity, the reality is in the UK, about 60% of neurodiverse learners don't share that they have a challenge. So when assessors are going in, from a reliability, as you touched on, and variability standpoint, you could be supporting everyone who's disclosed to you, right? To the best of your ability. But the reality is that you're still not creating fairness because there's a vast majority of people who aren't sharing with you that they have a need. I'd say that's.
I think all of that is entirely fair. And I think perhaps part of the problem is that when we design assessments today, we're still very much working to the same kind of processes that we were working to 10, 20, 30 years ago. I mean, we picked up a process where subject matter experts design an assessment which was probably intended to be delivered in a way that everyone gets the same physical paper, they get the same instructions, the same time, the same process, because there was a point in time where that was considered fairness. And we've probably all inherited the paper design process from those who came before us, who probably inherited the design process from those who came before them. And actually today, the world is really very different. I'm still not sure, to your point, that we recognise enough that the equal treatment and an equitable opportunity aren't the same thing. And that whole piece where we design an assessment, we start it a year before it's ever sat, or 18 months before it's ever sat, and then we just keep layering things on top of it to try and bring about fairness. It's just no longer the appropriate approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree. And I think what ends up happening is that operational logistics problem ends up becoming a bit of a nightmare to scale, because you're right, over the past 20 to 30 years, the way we conduct these assessments is very different, right? A lot of it has shifted online, and creating modified PDFs or separate physical testing rooms and things well introduces a big challenge just in terms of the operational aspect, but it's also, in a sense, I would say, kind of isolating candidates, because you're giving them separate tools that maybe, like you said before, they haven't seen before the assessment, so they're already, like you mentioned, facing let's say a barrier in terms of just learning how to use a tool that they haven't used in a normal schooling or normal assessment environment. And what I think we should be focusing more on doing is looking about how we can be embedding accessibility as something that's standardized, right? Because then it can overcome that cheating aspect we talked about with regulations, because you're giving more of an equal access where even the average learner might be able to use things like highlighting and listening in the same way that somebody who's dyslexic or visually impaired or any other plethora of needs, it might be a requirement for them, but making it more of a universal aspect, it frees up that operational manpower you have to focus on the people who maybe really do need separate rooms, separate assistants and things like this.
Yeah, I guess actually it kind of becomes a question about fairness by adjustment versus fairness by design. And today I still think a huge part of the sector relies upon fairness by adjustment. So we build the assessment, it takes however long it takes to build it, and then much later on in the process, almost as an afterthought, we start to add on these layers of accommodation or modifications for some of the candidates. Whereas if we start to think about it, to your point here about fairness by design, then that means we try to reduce the unnecessary barriers in the first place. So from the very beginning, we design the assessment to try and make sure that we remove those barriers at the outset, so that the accessibility that you speak about actually becomes part of the architecture of the assessment, rather than just a layer that we add on top and then another layer add on top at the end of the process, which speaks, I think, perfectly to your point. We don't know, if we have 1,000 candidates sitting in assessment, we don't know what particular challenges every one of those 1,000 candidates have. So I think we have to start to approach the design from a perspective of removing the barriers from the outset, rather than just trying to layer on accommodations at the end, which I think too many of us still do. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that adjustments don't matter, because they absolutely do it. And for many candidates, adjustments are completely essential. But if we're completely reliant upon them when it comes to assessing the fairness of our assessments, then are we actually building fair assessments, or are we building assessments that almost have to be repaired once they're finished?
Absolutely. And I think one of the common things I saw personally, as somebody who went through the school system, and as I'm sure Christina and a lot of other people out there could attest to, is that even when you do disclose and you let your assessor know or you let your teacher know what you need, a lot of the time we end up giving people the same accommodations regardless of whether it actually meets their needs or not. I think the classic one is just giving extra time. And I think when we met in person, Robbie, we talked about this because I mentioned how when I was at school, I remember that ticking clock that I'd constantly be paying attention to. I'd keep coming back to it. I'd be flicking down at my page and going back up and realizing I'd wasted, 5-10 minutes of my assessment time just thinking about how that clock's ticking down and it's distracting my mind. And actually, according to cognitive load theory and processing efficiency studies that I'd looked into, that actually about 25% of a candidate's performance can be dropping under strict time pressure, and that can be directly attributed to the fact that it might be interface anxiety or things like this as well. And I think a lot of the time, the extra time wouldn't have helped me. Actually, just having an alternative would have helped me a lot more.
Yeah, I can understand that, and I spent many years in the sector. There's almost a safety net, a defensibility about, we've got medical evidence, and the medical evidence says we apply X, so we apply X. From an organisation's perspective, I can absolutely understand why that approach, it feels safe and defendable, and it's something that we stick to. When the medical opinion comes in, it doesn't actually take into account what the format of the assessment actually is. Assessments are different the world over. And to your point, Hugh, I think that there's an ease within the process of saying that we've got this particular challenge, we'll apply 25%. It's the standard, it's easy to apply, it's easy to defend, let's just roll with it, without actually taking into account whether that really is helping the candidates to get across the barriers that are in the assessment. But it has become standardised because it's easy, and it's a massive shift to ask the industry to make. But I do think we are at that point where we have to stop thinking about what's easy for us as organisations to implement and to defend, and think about what's right for the candidates.
Yeah. I think it's easy to, like you said, kind of slap on extra time. But there's also, to Hugh's point, just being really distracted about the ticking time. And also, speaking from personal experience, there's like a shame element to it. Like if you ever needed, a quiet room or something, and it's like, well, why is that candidate being put off to another room? Why do I have to go into a separate room? Now I'm separate from everybody else. And now I'm spending my test time feeling ashamed and feeling different and excluded, even though ultimately it is to help me. But yeah, now I'm in a weird room by myself. I'm being given extra time. Maybe people don't think it's fair. People notice that I need this, and it's embarrassing.
Yeah, and that actually speaks back to Hugh's point about so many candidates don't actually approach us to tell us that they have challenges or barriers.
Definitely.
Perhaps because they don't want to be seen as that candidate in the room on their own who's getting special treatment. But actually what it also does is, from the other perspective, I've spoken to many candidates who didn't get adjustments, who, just because of the lack of transparency, they perceive that there's an imbalance and that the candidate in the room with the extra time actually has an advantage because there isn't the transparency that lets everyone approach the assessment from the same place. So you end up in a world where actually perhaps none of the candidates really think that what's happening is fair. But again, it's quite easily defensible for the organisation to say, well, we got evidence, we applied the adjustment, we've done what we want to do. It just comes back to thinking about it from a defensibility perspective and not from a candidate's perspective. And I think that's where we really need to change our approach.
When I'm talking to people about assessment and taking more of a universal approach to the way that we build learning environments, is we talk about the curb cut effect, which is this concept that in our public spaces, we made the decision to make them more accessible by lowering the curbs, right? So now somebody in a wheelchair has access. But the reality is we then all benefit, right? Because you can cross with your pram, you can cross with your trolley or your suitcase as well. We're all benefiting from that in the same way we benefit from using a lift to carry heavy objects up instead of the stairs.
Yeah.
When we're building the architecture of our assessment designs, what we're kind of asking a lot of candidates to do is imagine they're in a wheelchair, is saying, right, here's the street. You've got to cross the curb over there. There's no lowered curb, but I'm going to give you 20 minutes extra to do it. And that's what I think is happening a lot of the time, unfortunately. Obviously, it's what's being advised. And as you say, a lot of medical professionals who might be telling you about the diagnosis aren't assessment experts. So they can't really tell you what the right thing is to do in some circumstances. Like you say, from a reliability angle, the extra time is great because you're giving that parity to everyone. But it is failing both sides because it's creating animosity, I would say, to a certain extent, with the average learner feeling like somebody else is getting something that they aren't. And on the other side, it's not actually helping the person who needs the accommodation because the extra time is not helping them with their struggle, basically.
Yeah, I was thinking back to, when I was in high school, I took a chemistry class and I think I had to work really hard for a C. And that was like doing all the homework, putting in extra hours, staying after with the teacher, trying to ask questions. We were just sitting and doing chemical equations. And, sitting still, first of all, is not good for me. And secondly, sitting and doing boring math all day, I'm never going to get anywhere. It just goes in one ear and out the other. But then I took a chemistry class in college, and what do you know? It was all labs, and it was a very hands-on physical way of doing things. And I just wish that for exams I wouldn't be sitting. The reasonable accommodation, like you said, with the curb effect. Sitting in a room with a whole bunch of other students tapping their pencil or shaking their leg, or a pin drops in the classroom and now I can't focus on the exam anymore. Maybe something like standing up or moving or taking an exam on a treadmill would have been perfect for me because I need movement because it
For me, I was just like, just give me some noise canceling headphones would probably be a
seriously.
good start. That would have solved a lot of things for me, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that it's a reasonable enough thing where, yeah, you can sit in the exam hall with everybody else and I'm not getting any extra time. I'm not getting any special treatment. I don't have to go into my own little room and my own quiet room to take my exam. I'm actually, yeah, you're giving me a reasonable accommodation that would actually be beneficial, that doesn't include bringing in a treadmill to distract everybody else.
I think, to be fair, Cristina, that beautifully typifies why fairness by design is so powerful, because it improves access broadly for everyone rather than just individually. And Hugh's analogy was brilliant. And you could almost extend it a little bit. If you think that we're going to build a new building today, we can build it and then we can think about afterwards putting in all the accessibility features, which ends up taking us more time, costing us more money, and they're just kind of bolted on at the end as an afterthought. Or we can design and build the building with accessibility as part of the design from the very beginning, where we don't have all those peripheral issues. It doesn't become an afterthought. It's actually part of the design of the building, so it flows better, it sits better, it works better. And fairness by design is such a much more powerful way to build an assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to kind of bring it back to the other perspective here, maybe a inflammatory question, but I know that from the institution perspective, they're going, well, there has to be barriers somewhere. There are some barriers that are necessary. So what barriers, from either of your perspective, Robbie, you have the institution perspective and Hugh, the accessibility, what barriers are actually necessary in assessment?
Yeah, maybe Robbie can kind of elaborate on this a lot better than I can from an assessment perspective. But I think the term I would use is the construct relevance, right? Like, is this actually assessing what it needs to be? I think the problem is, I could take an example, let's say like an accountant exam or something, where you want to test them on their tax code calculations, but you're forcing them to look at some kind of really poorly formatted, tiny font with no spacing table that's just becoming a barrier which has nothing to do with their actual accountancy competency. It's just a straight barrier for that person to use. So, I think traditionally, when I speak to a lot of assessors, they're offering this idea of kind of rigor with maybe suffering almost, like removing reading pressure is lowering the standard or something. But actually, we all realize, and I think everyone listening to this will know that in the real world, professionals use tools for what they're doing, and they use those tools like screen readers if you're an engineer or something, or spell checkers and calculators every day in your daily life. And I think what you should be thinking about is if the barrier is valid because it's making sure that you're assessing the core competency, then absolutely yes, it needs to be there. If it's a musician who needs to sight read, it's important that they can do that in an exam. But if it's not part of that core competency, I would argue that actually there already exists a lot of technology which can be compliant with assessment environments, like text to speech, for instance, where you can be solving a lot of the barriers without it affecting the validity of the assessment.
Yeah, I think that's important. And again, just to stress that we're not trying to suggest here is that all barriers should be removed, because there are some demands that are absolutely legitimate because they're part of the competence that's being assessed. There are some assessments where the ability to respond under time pressure is an integral part of the construct. Using digital tools is relevant, understanding complex instructions. But there are assessments where barriers, if you want to call them that, are absolutely relevant. But what we need to ask ourselves is whether the challenges that we're building into the assessment are actually relevant to what's being assessed, or are they just incidental? If I'm accessing mathematical reasoning, then is unnecessarily complex language or awkward navigation or unfamiliar digital tools, are they doing anything other than distorting the actual result that I'm trying to assess? And that, I think, is where we have to start to think about when we design assessments for fairness at the beginning, is that if there are barriers, are they there because they need to be there, because they are part of what we're trying to measure, or are they simply there because they've always been there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I would 100% agree. I think you touched on this earlier on as well, Robbie, about second language aspects as well. I think that's one of the ones that's often overlooked. Just assessing somebody on reading content can actually introduce problems where if they'd been able to read and listen, a lot of the time second language speakers are more competent and fluent in spoken language, right? And just hearing something that might, be a homophone, or just that has some homogeneity in the way it's written, or like you said, like some Latinate language or something like this, can be overcome just by giving multiple means of accessing that content. I'm trying to think of a good analogy here, but maybe it's not so much about lowering the ceiling of requirements, but building a new floor where that floor takes into account more people's needs, so that it puts them more in equal footing, and you can then focus on the barriers that are about what you're assessing.
Yeah, and actually the language one is a really powerful one. I've worked with quite a lot of organisations, including relatively recently, where their solution to the second language issue is you can bring in a translation dictionary. Now we've all sat in exams, and when you're sitting in an exam and you've got an exam paper and you've got time pressure and everything that goes on in that environment, probably the last thing that you want to add to your burden is, I'm also going to have to go and try and look up this word or this phrase or this sentence in a translation dictionary, because that isn't really helping anyone. There are so many better ways now to address that than to say to a candidate, yeah, bring in a translation dictionary, which you would never use in the real world today anyway. And so, yeah, so many better ways to take away those barriers today, if we actually start to think about how we design the assessments with the candidate in mind, and not just with the process in mind.
So what would a genuinely fairness first design process look like? So, that approach would take us from how do we support candidates with accommodations and take us more towards why did we create this barrier in the first place?
If we're serious about fairness, then it's got to come at the start of the process. We need to start with the construct, be really clear on what we're trying to measure. And then once that's clear, we can start to ask ourselves what demands are absolutely essential to that construct and which ones are just there because they've always been there. So again, it's thinking about the whole build of that assessment differently from the beginning and not just thinking about it as being about technical subject matter expertise, but also about accessibility.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about treating accessibility not as an operational problem at the end, but something that's fundamental as a pedagogical problem. There's a lot of ways you can be embedding accessibility that are maybe a lot easier and more compliant than people think with assessment spaces now online. So a lot of those barriers you can be overcoming from just simply opening up access. From a kind of assessment perspective, I think also giving multiple means of engaging with the exam is just a better exam because everyone processes and learns information differently, not just people on the ends of the spectrum. The classic example I use is when I ask people, how many of you would prefer to listen to a podcast? Put your hand up. And you'll see so many people now would rather be listening to content than reading it. And it's kind of spoken out by the numbers as well. When we look at literacy rates, a lot of that has adapted since previous generations. And I think treating that as something that can be embedded also opens you up to be able to focus more on the people who do really need very tailored accommodations and requirements. It's kind of killing two birds with one stone. Can't think of a better analogy than that. But also, like you say, a lot of the time these assessments are being built by subject matter experts, right? And some people might get lucky and have an SME who's really clued up on accessibility and bakes it into the way they're doing it. But equally, they could have really no understanding or no, let's say, thoughts about how that would fit into their assessment, right? So like you say, embedding at the start, but also bringing in, I would say, accessibility expert is, I think, a fundamental part of how we should be building assessments.
I agree, because I think bringing in people that also experience neurodiversity themselves, because you can have somebody that says, here's how I think this assessment should be built or delivered. Yeah, and I appreciate, and empathize with all of this. Of course, I can give my perspective, Hugh can give his perspective, and you can listen to people that need these sort of accommodations, but there is an operational cost to it. There's a way we've always done it, and this was passed down from the person before me, and now I do it this way because they did it this way and it's always worked. Does it work? No, but the cost of shifting and thinking about the candidate first and what that would entail, both time-wise, operational-wise, costs, all of that is, I can appreciate that that's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. There's a mindset shift that has to take place before we even get to the point of changing the processes. But again, I would just argue that it comes back to us really being honest with ourselves about whether we're designing assessments to be fair or we're just designing them the way we always have done because they can be accommodated at the end.
Yeah,
I think there's a lot of work that a lot of us in the sector can do to make our design more candidate focused and to make them more fair. And yet there's work and there's time and there's money and there's cost involved. But if that means that the 5 or 10% of the candidates who are currently sitting at a 45 or a 46 could actually be moved into a 51 or a 52 because we're designing better assessments more fairly, then I actually think that work and effort is worth it for those candidates who are currently failing today, not because they lack the competence or because they lack the skills or because they lack whatever it is that we're trying to assess, just because they are being hindered by the barriers that are in place that don't really have anything to do with that assessment.
Yeah. And just to speak to your point there, Cristina, I think what a lot of assessors don't realize is that the costs are there. They're just hidden in that operational bubble. This kind of hidden cost because you're having to pay for separate invigilators, separate exam spaces, separate tools and equipment, all these things. And a lot of it is just sunk costs in terms of hours, right? That is spent on making those extra aspects. So I think the mindset shift that assessors should be thinking about as well is actually there's a lot of costs we could be averting by switching. But also on top of that, regulations coming in on that, whether it's in Europe or in the UK as well, with Ofsted's focus on accessibility. This is coming and it's not going away. And the cost might just be bore out that if you're the last one to cross the racetrack, it's not going to be good for you as assessors if other people have gone ahead and made these changes and you're the last one to make the change.
Just to further expand on that cost point, there are costs. The way that we design the process today, where we layer onto the back end of the process the accessibility adjustments and the various things to try and make the assessment fairer, there's actually a huge cost and risk from an operational side on that. So it's one thing saying that we'll add these layers on top, but you've actually got a whole industry then at the back end where the operational teams have to implement and evaluate and ensure that all those adjustments are still added fairly and consistently, and they can push to the exam panels and boards that's all been done the way it should have been done. So there's a huge operational cost and burden at that side of it that actually if we shifted it and we started to push more of the assessment design, thought and work to the beginning, you actually take away a lot of that operational burden at the end. And if we're building an assessment which is accessible to everybody, then again, you make the whole delivery part much, much simpler. So you lose a lot of the cost and a lot of the risk of having to administer all of those different adjustments that we're layering on at the end. I think all that happens is we shift those costs to earlier in the process rather than actually create new costs. If we took a step back and we thought about, if someone came to us today for the first time and asked us to design an assessment from scratch, knowing what we know today about accessibility and about candidate diversity and digital tools and all the accessibility things that we know today, would we actually end up with the same process, the same design process as we've currently got in place? And I suspect that for a huge majority of the organisations out there, the answer to that would probably be no.
Thank you so much, Robbie and Hugh. That was a really interesting discussion, and I think that everybody will walk away with hopefully a new perspective on accessibility and assessment design. So we'll leave you with one final question. When a candidate succeeds or fails an assessment, are we always certain we're measuring the capability we intended to measure? Or are we sometimes measuring confidence, familiarity, digital fluency, the ability to navigate the assessment itself? Like, we don't want to measure these things. They're not important things to be measuring when it comes to are they capable or are they not. Fairness isn't just about treating everybody the same. You need to give people an opportunity, a genuine opportunity to demonstrate what they know and what they can do. That starts with being willing to question the assumptions we've built into our assessments and a little self-reflection. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.